Here we are in the herbarium at Murdoch Hall, Linfield College, home to Linfield's chemistry and biology departments. I wanted to pick this spot today for this lecture because it's emblematic of a whole series of disciplines that wouldn't, well, they'd probably be possible, but they certainly wouldn't flourish the way they do, and they certainly wouldn't have the role they have in modern life and culture if it weren't for the epistemological innovation I want to talk about today. What is that epistemological innovation? That epistemological innovation is something called empiricism. Basically what empiricism is a way of looking at the world, a way of thinking about knowledge specifically, in which the basis of understanding is not simply reason. Rather, what it is sense experience. Reason still is going to have a role within this. It's going to be the organizer of sense experience. But if we ask, what exactly is the content? What is it that allows ideas and really knowledge to subsist in the mind? It's going to come down to sense experience. It is not, as Descartes and the rationalists would say, innate ideas. And the reason why this is going to become so important is because it is through the rising up and celebration and development of empiricism that you have so many of the empirical developments that come out of modern science. Right? It would be almost impossible to establish, say, the periodic chart, right? The periodic table of elements without empirical observations and rational analysis of these empirical observations. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because before we can begin to talk about empiricism and the father of modern empiricism, a philosopher who some of you may have heard of before, named John Locke, we need to say a little about what gave rise to empiricism, what gave it its birth, its emphasis, its chutzpah, right? What got it going? Well, what got it going was a reaction to rationalism and some of the problems that can come from rationalism. Now, you might have the idea, after reading Voltaire, that rationalism is something that was really for, I don't know, fuddy-duddies and pin-headed mathematicians. And to some extent you might be right. But it was not quite as ridiculous and absurd as Voltaire made it sound. It certainly wasn't as blind as Voltaire made it sound. Think back on what we've discovered already from Descartes and from the rationalists, right? We have seen that rationalism has given us, from Descartes onward, a methodological precision to our thinking, right? A way in which its epistemology allowed us to face the challenges of radical doubt and arrive at something that was conceptually beyond the possibility of doubt, at least according to this methodology. So it's very precise, and it's very sharp and effective as a methodology. It's a rational methodology. Another thing that rationalism did is it gave a conceptual rigor and a clarity in terms of the conditions that are required to say that we know something. Remember Descartes going on and on and on about clear and distinct ideas? Right? Remember him talking about how concepts are known not because they are seen or because they are supposed, but rather because they are known through some sort of logical demonstration, mathematically almost. Well, this kind of rigor was a great innovation. It's an epistemological innovation, and it's an innovation towards our thinking in general. It gave, even more than this, a way of applying this rigor to observations of the world. Something that we get a sense of a little bit with Descartes, and we see perhaps even more with Leibniz and other great scientists, especially of the 17th century, who were sympathetic with Descartes, was that this notion of taking mathematics, mathematical thinking, mathematical reasoning, applying the logic of mathematical reasoning to what we observe and saying this is how we actually know what something is, and reducing it down to a mathematical equation, this was an extraordinary achievement, right? I think the classical example of this is Galileo. He is bar none the best example of this, right? And of course, with all of this, with this methodological precision, with this conceptual rigor, with this capacity to take mathematical analysis and apply it to our thinking, you have, of course, the general modern theme of our adequacy and capacity as human beings to be able to deal with the situation around us. We are rational minds, and insofar as we are rational minds and can use the operations of rationality to understand the world, we're in a position to begin making deductions about things. It was because of this that rationalism seemed to be on the right track. It was because of this that rationalism developed this sense of optimism, an optimism that Voltaire satirized and critiqued, but at the end of the day, it still was a very impressive thing. And one thing I would point out, I've seen this in the threads, a lot of people thought that Voltaire was cynical certainly about rationalism and maybe about his disposition towards ideas in general. This isn't quite right. Voltaire's thinking wasn't so much cynical as it was simply trying to bring up and address a lot of what the problems were in rationalism despite all of these rigors. Okay, well, so what are these problems despite all of these rigors? I mean, after all, it seems like it can achieve a lot. And Voltaire, even though he's satirizing and makes for a great story, he doesn't necessarily identify exactly philosophically what this is. What were the problems that rationalism had in itself? Well, there's several to speak of. For one thing, there was a problem with regard to the relationship between experience and ideas. You remember one of the things that the rationalists tended to have a huge push behind was that ideas were separated from experience. Experience was in some sense what clothing is to the body, right? It was something that was draped over it, it made it appear in a certain way, but it had nothing to do with the actual idea itself. Well, that's fine, I suppose, theoretically, but it doesn't take much of a thought experiment to think about how much could you actually think about if there was no such thing as experience. There's a very famous thought experiment. It's an old thought experiment. It's actually much older than even the rationalists or empiricists. Probably the most famous person to talk about it was a medieval Persian philosopher named Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who he called it the flying man argument. And he said, imagine a man who was magically born in space. So he's never met anybody, and he simply floated there. And he couldn't see, or taste, or touch, or hear, or smell. He had no access to the senses. He's never moved. He's never engaged in anything. He's never encountered anything. Could he begin to think? Could he know who or what he was? Now, Avicenna, who tended to be a little more sympathetic towards what comes to be rationalism, tended to lean into the idea of, yeah, he could begin to think, and goes into a long discourse about this. But this idea gets picked up by these critics of the rationalists to say, give me an example of what he would think about. Even something like mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4. While he might be aware of there might be some kind of awareness of the principles, perhaps, there's still a way in which he wouldn't be able to manifest it. How would he know what 2 was if he had never seen 2 things? How would he know what 2 was if there had never been a world within which he could begin counting? Right? So this was one thing. Doesn't experience have to be a little bit closer to ideas in order for ideas to be real than what the rationalists are saying? A second thing that the critics of the rationalists brought up is the extension of knowledge, just how much do ideas, and for that matter knowledge, require reason in order to establish themselves? Right? How important is reason in making an idea? Is it, as the rationalists say, the entirety of the idea? Or is it something that is a little more like a skeleton of the idea with something else involved in it? The reason behind this is because if we try to imagine simply what reason is, and I've seen some of you guys do this already, if you try to ask what exactly reason is, it's a little bit difficult to do. You can apply things to reason, but reason itself is so conceptually skeletal to the formation of our ideas, it's so much sort of inside there, it's really hard to know what that is. So we have this problem. We have the problem, and this is one of the central problems, of innate ideas. What exactly warrants us thinking that an idea is innate? Or put another way, is knowledge really naturally intuitive? What I mean by that is that if we have this idea, as Descartes and the rationalists did, that ideas and knowledge are simply operations of reason, they're products of reason, right? A little like functions within a computer program. One of the things that comes up with regard to this is a question that why do we suppose that these are there? Is there a way that we've ever learned these ideas? How is it that they come up? How is it that we arrive at them? If they're intuitive, shouldn't they always be present? Descartes seemed to think, well, no, what you have to do is you have to work through the operations to arrive at them. But it doesn't take much thinking to realize that this is just hedging your bets. Are they really already there? Is all possible knowledge already contained in the powers of reason? You know, this is kind of a strange thing conceptually to say, and doesn't seem to fit with what we know about our own knowing in the world. At least not quite. Of course, we've also seen the problem of externality. How do we know about this world that's outside of us? What is the relationship of our knowledge to the outside world? Are we simply supposed to believe that there is a world out there and that reason is working around it? Are we supposed to say that, as the later rationalists did, that reason simply participates in it? Because if that's the case, I'm not sure that there's any difference between a world that is out there and the world that is in here. Perhaps there's no distinction between them. But if there is, again, this seems strange to how we encounter the world, right? So these were some of the problems that we faced. Oh, and then there's one more too I think I'd like to bring up, and that is the problem of the limits of knowledge. You begin to see, after Descartes with the rationalists, a question of just how much are we capable of knowing? How far does knowledge go, right? Is knowledge something, as the rationalists in the midst of their optimism seem to claim, that, well, in every day, in every way, as we work through the world rationally, we're going to become having a clearer and clearer and clearer idea until we see all the possibilities of what something is in its entirety, right? This is something that we begin to see at work here. And that's problematic, because clearly we don't know everything. The question becomes, for the philosopher, why precisely don't we know everything? Why precisely are we incapable of knowing these things? Now, I've tried to put these questions up because these are some, and they're by no means exhaustive. There's many questions that begin to pop up towards rationalism. But I wanted to bring it up because the theme of rationalism comes up again and again and again through the modern period, through modern thinking. And each time it comes up, and it sort of rises up and takes dominance more than once, to some extent in our cyberific age that we live in, an age of computers and logical systems. It's rising up again. But whenever it comes up, it confronts these problems about the nature of knowing, about the nature of externality, about the limits of knowledge, about the relationship between reason and experience. And it's confronting these and seeing what the alternatives are that we have to consider. The first great alternative that we see facing modern philosophy rising up in the 18th century, the counter-argument to the rationalist epistemology, is empiricism. And the father of modern empiricism is a man named John Locke. Now this is the same John Locke that I imagine many of you have heard of before. This is the John Locke that wrote the two treatises on government, the John Locke that wrote, amongst other things, the basic criteria for a just commonwealth was that it guaranteed a right to life, a right to liberty, and a right to property. Three basic rights that were only 70 or 80 short years later lifted up by Thomas Jefferson and put into the Declaration of Independence. So there you go, important for us. But in addition to being a political philosopher, John Locke was an epistemologist. In fact, in some ways, as far as the history of philosophy goes, I'd say he's as important as an epistemologist, maybe even more important as an epistemologist, in his epistemology for philosophy than he was in his political theory. What did he propose? What is it that John Locke's empiricism brought forward? What did it offer us? Well, let's be clear. John Locke's empiricism, as I said, was dealing primarily with the idea that ideas and knowledge are matters of experience, that they are constituted by sense experience, and that they are organized, that sense experience is organized by the power of reason, but it's composed of sense experience, right? It's a composite. And given that that's the case, it's important to realize Locke is not rejecting the power of reason. He's not rejecting the necessity of reason. Rather, he is simply saying that ideas must consist of sense experience in order to be coherent. And because they must consist of sense experience in order to be coherent, there has to be some, when we have an idea, it has to come from some way in which we perceived it. It must subsist in experience rather than pure reason, the way Descartes and the rationalists thought, right? Subsists in experience rather than in pure reason. Okay, great. So what else? What does he propose? Well, first of all, in doing this, Locke proposes that the natural state of the mind is not as this basic operating system that is endowed and indeed imbued with innate ideas. That's not what he proposes. Instead, what Locke said was that our mind is, another term you may have heard before, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Literally, we come into the world, our mind is innately without any ideas. But what it has is this. It has, even though there are no innate ideas in our thinking, it has this capacity to be rational, right? It has this inherent operating capacity, even though it doesn't initially have anything to operate with. It still has the power to do the operation. Secondly, it's sensitive. That is to say that we have these organs, our eyes, our skin, our nose, our ears, and that these organs receive impressions and are left with impressions by powers in the world, right? So What you've got epistemologically for Locke, then, it's not a situation in which there is a world where the mind sort of reasons and operates and tries to come to know what it needs to know. Instead, what you've got for Locke is the idea that the mind is equipped with this capacity to begin knowing, but the way that it's going to come to know, is by receiving these, as he puts it, powers, so that sight or light comes into our eyes and makes sightful impressions upon the mind. That touch comes through our skin and makes touching impressions upon our mind. Or sound through our ears and makes audible impressions upon our mind. And these impressions are, for Locke, very, very simple. They're immediate. They indeed don't have a name. So, as an example, when I have these simple impressions, what he calls simple ideas or sensations, say I'm looking at my coat right here, right? Or I'm looking at one of these plants. And you might say, well, you see my coat and it's black. You see the plant and it's green. Actually, these simple impressions aren't even blackness or greenness, because I don't have the wherewithal to name them. It's just a basic, raw unit of sense experience that comes in, that is received by my mind and makes an impression, right? But you can see from this that I'm bombarded by these impressions, right? I'm being bombarded all the time by all these impressions that are coming in, that are flooding in through my eyes and ears and skin and nose and all this stuff, and they're boom, 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 and making a pattern, a mosaic, if you like, of impressions upon my mind. This brings me to a couple of other important points I need to bring up about Locke's epistemology, his empirical epistemology. First of all, you can see from the way in which I've been talking about this, that these simple ideas are simple ideas that don't come from me going out and looking for them, because after all, when this begins, when we're in this tabula rasa state, the mind doesn't even know to begin looking at things. The mind is, another important point here, inherently passive for Locke. It's inherently passive. That is to say that when we come to know something, the way that we come to know it is because it has been impressed upon us by the power of some sort of external entity, right? So that there is a world of things. And we don't know exactly what these things are for Locke. Rather, what we know is there are things, and that these things have powers that we receive. And what are these powers that we receive? Well, they're things like sight, to taste, to touch, and smell. And they come in and they flood in and they make our thinking about the world. They make our ideas about the world, right? But we're passive to it. A second thing to keep in mind about this with Locke is that these ideas, these simple ideas that we have, don't remain simple in the mind for long. Rather, what they do is they begin to composite, sort of aggregate upon themselves in some way. And the way that they do this is by the mind taking its internal capacity for reasoning, right? Because we've said this power is inside of the mind already, it just doesn't have anything to work with. The mind takes this internal capacity for reasoning and begins to reflect, this is his term, to reflect upon these simple impressions. What is reflecting upon simple impressions? Well, it's putting them together. It's associating them. It's creating patterns and habits and connections between things. Right? What happens, in other words, is that our mind initially receives passively all this information. But while it receives all this information, it's reflecting upon this information that's being impressed upon the mind. And because it's reflecting upon all this information that's being impressed upon the mind, it's making complex ideas, right? This is the very easy analogy to see with this, is that this is very much like the way atoms, through molecular or through chemical reactions, become molecules, and that these molecules then become more complex molecules because one molecule reacts with another molecule, reacts with another molecule, and they become, you know, these specific physical entities that express matter in a particular way. Well, in the same way that the atoms build up into molecules through chemical reactions and become particular expressions of matter with particular properties, so it is with our ideas. So it is with the way that we are impressed with these senses, that we reflect upon these senses with the power of reason, and from this make more and more complex ideas. Now, there's something that becomes a little more, I guess you might say, radical when you think about this, the implications of this for Locke. Because what it's going to mean for Locke is that everything that we know then, and I mean everything that we know, ultimately comes out of sense experience. Now, to us, especially us living in the United States, with our British intellectual heritage and our propensity towards empiricism, you might not have known this, but this is our epistemology in this country, just as far as popular culture goes, tends to lean towards the empirical. Think about how many people talk about having to go out and experience something. That does come from somewhere. But in saying this, there are certain things that it's rather difficult to imagine experiencing, and you kind of wonder how you would come to the idea of them merely through experience. I mean, it's one thing if I say, well, you have to experience green or black in order to know what green or black are. Okay, fine, that seems pretty reasonable. And you might even say, well, I have to experience, you know, cheesecake in order to know what cheesecake is. Maybe I even have to experience something like democracy and be in a democratic country in order to know what democracy is and compare it to other things that aren't democracy. Okay, fine. But what about something that seems almost beyond experience, like infinity, like a transcendent God? You know, these ideas, you don't experience these. I mean, you might say, well, I believe in them, or you might infer them. Okay, fine, but you don't experience them, at least not in terms of sense experience. How's Locke going to get to that? Well, Locke's going to say that even utterly abstract ideas like this still arise ultimately out of experience. And they arise out of very complex ways in which we have to deal with problems of experience. So, for instance, with regard to infinity, right? How does infinity come out of experience? Well, one of the things Locke says is whenever we experience things and we reflect upon these experiences, we begin through our reason to observe something about this experience. And what do we observe? Well, there's always something beyond, past the horizon. There's always more to know. It just keeps coming and coming and coming. There is an endlessness to this experience. There doesn't seem to be a place where experience just stops. When this happens, when we observe this and we develop these reflections in our mind, when that happens, we begin to develop a concept called infinity. Now, it's not as though we see infinity. It's not as though infinity is something that we sense. But it is an idea that we come to through sense experience. Not immediately sensing experience, but sense experience, reflecting a lot, right? And making a very, very complex idea about that and then projecting that onto the world. Suffice to say, everything we know, the totality of the world that we know, is known through experience. And one more thing, it's not just known through experience, but in those terms, it's also limited by experience. That which goes beyond the bounds of the possibility of experience, whatever it is that we might claim to know that has nothing to do with experience, either with the sense impressions that we have with experience or what we would make from this experience through our rational reflections on it, even very complex things like infinity, are things that we cannot know. And I mean we cannot know in that they are utterly beyond the scope of knowledge at all, right? They're beyond the ken of that. Now, think about what that means. Think about what that means for, say, the external world and objects. Think about what that means for the problem of solipsism that we talked about with Descartes. Descartes, in his optimism, thought he had found a way out of this. Well, don't worry about the physical world. The physical world doesn't really have to do with anything. It's kind of an illusion. It's all about rationality, and we can proceed forward. That's what's real. That's what Descartes says. Yeah, fine. Locke's already pointed out some of the problems with that approach. But then we begin to say, how do we know? What is it to know about the external world? How do I know that a thing is actually there? How do I know that something exists beyond the limits of experience? Or that there is an object that is powering these senses? How do I know that? Well, this is the question that Locke more or less put to the side in his work. But it is a profound problem. Because with this issue coming up, where we recognize that what I know of the world is limited by the capacity of my mind to take in experience and work with experience, I begin to wonder just how much can I say about the way the world truly is. And when we begin to look at David Hume, and David Hume's criticisms of this, when he talks about relations of ideas and matters of fact, the way he brings up the skepticism, this isn't just going to doubt the possibility that we know about the world. It's going to limit the possibilities of knowing in the world and indeed knowing it all. And it certainly is going to limit, or at least change, what we call metaphysics entirely, our claims to truth. But we'll get to that next.